And Her Majesties, Excellencies, distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bimbika Sujapati. I'm a social scientist and gender coordinator at CIFOR. Today I'm going to give you a brief overview of how CIFOR is addressing gender and rights in our research globally, including in Indonesia. And in the process, I will represent my own views and also summarize many of my colleagues' work who are present in this room today. So the forestry sector has a long history of engaging with gender issues. For instance, in my home country, Nepal, women's inclusion in forestry programs dates back to the first master plan in the forestry sector in the late 1980s. But for gender issues to be considered seriously in forestry policy, practice, and research, it had to be framed in terms of how gender equality and women's empowerment would contribute to sustainable forest management, reduce deforestation, poverty reduction, and other environmental and developmental goals. As a researcher, practitioner, and someone actively following progress on women's rights, both globally and in my home country, I found these concerns relevant but inadequate for three reasons. First, why cannot gender equality and women's rights be goals in and of themselves? Why must they be viewed principally as instruments for reaching other objectives? After all, there are glaring and persistent inequalities in rights, resources, and representation in most of the developing countries. And the forestry sector has much to contribute to addressing them. For instance, research in India has shown that reducing deforestation can augment access to forest foods and income, and are particularly important for poor women. And I saw that women, just as men, are differentiated along class, caste, and other social differences. And women, just as men, are not conservation friendly if there are no adequate incentives in place, if their entitlements over resources such as land are insecure, and if the responsibility for caring for children and elderly falls disproportionately on their shoulders. So just adding women is just not sufficient to guaranteeing better forest management outcomes. When women are just added into existing forestry and conservation programs without thinking through how these policies and programs could also be beneficial to them, then women's presence is just tokenistic. And even worse, existing gender inequalities are heightened because women now need to add participation in forestry projects and programs alongside everything else that they have to do every day. Under the global framework on sustainable development since mid-2000s, I have witnessed a substantial change. The MDGs recognize gender equality and women's empowerment as a goal in and of themselves, and also integrated into other development goals. But the SDGs has gone further and included many of the underlying causes of gender inequalities, such as access to land and resources, distribution of care, that women's movement have been advocating for many generations. The Swedish government's Feminist Foreign Policy 2015-2018 and efforts to channel support and funding in a way that strengthens women's rights, representation, access to resources, serves to add further weight and legitimacy to these global agreements. At CIFOR, we've embraced these broader changes and aligned our work within this global framework in terms of the research we undertake, how we communicate our work, and the range of actors we work with to ensure that gender equality and women's empowerment objectives are at the heart of sustainable development debates and solutions. This is just a global map of where we're working. So please allow me to give you a few illustrations from the work of many of my colleagues. So on forest and land rights, CIFOR has a very long history of documenting progress in handing over forest management rights and responsibilities to local and indigenous communities. CIFOR researchers working in Uganda and Nicaragua have gone a step further and worked alongside women and men in local communities to document the range of rights that women access and how this compares to their male counterparts. The researchers found that there are glaring disparities in rights, and yet responsibilities for force management are shared between the genders. They also found that when women feel their rights are secure and not dependent on men's, they are more likely to make investment decisions that are good for them and good for forests. On climate change, CIFOR's research on REDD+, one of the main core and cross-cutting issues, has been tracing whether and how women participate in REDD+ framework from subnational, national to global levels. For instance, across 5 countries and 60-plus research sites where this research is underway, CIFOR researchers have found that women know much less about REDD projects and are involved in very marginal ways. Hence, in decisions that could fundamentally alter the landscapes in which they live in, women have limited voice and influence. CIFOR researchers working on REDD+ are actively working with relevant government agencies such as the Ministry of Women's Empowerment and Child Protection in Indonesia, as well as National Women's Machinery for developing principles and guidelines for integrating gender in REDD+ design and implementation. CIFOR researchers working on climate change adaptation, mitigation, and on the synergies between the two are also drawing on their research to inform a wide range of policies at the global level, including the upcoming gender policy of the Green Climate Change Fund. In addition to embedding gender considerations more deeply and systematically in the themes that CIFOR has worked on, since the center was first set up, we are also actively expanding gender research in new and emerging areas. We are working towards expanding the global debate on corporate commitments to eliminate deforestation from supply chains by monitoring whether women have a meaningful voice in decisions related to land conversion, whether corporate practices uphold global standards of decent employment, and whether services that are extended to local communities and smallholders target both women and men. In the process, our work is informing alliances and platforms for implementing and monitoring zero deforestation commitment and multi-stakeholder processes, such as those establishing social and environmental standards. One of the major drivers of forest and land use change in many tropical and subtropical countries is migration, urbanization. In Nepal, remittances contribute 1/3 of the GDP, and 90% of the migrants are men. We are finding that the impact of male-out migration for women who are left behind can be dramatically different depending on what forest management institutions and social structures they have in their communities. We are actively working with our research and development partners to understand the kinds of policy reforms, institutional changes, and cultural shifts needed to support women who are left behind so that they can be at the forefront of forest management efforts. So in summary, the forestry sector has much to contribute towards combating gender inequalities and enhancing the full enjoyment of human rights by women and girls. By aligning CIFOR's work closely with the global framework on sustainable development, we hope to contribute knowledge and evidence to advance a global vision rather than strive for results in a piecemeal and isolated manner. Thank you very much.